Episode 315, a catch-up. This is The Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Apparently the last episodes failed to load through the interwebs, as I discovered this morning when I sat down to write today's script. An error in the RSS feed, I believe, which I think I've fixed. So I'm combining the last few episodes into one just for this episode. On top of that, COVID is bouncing around the community again. Naturally, the cruise ships are arriving once again. Mandates are gone and I'm rat testing daily because of where I work. 5 cases in our tiny part of the organisation in the last week. And Mrs. Change Underground is 3 days into her 3rd infection. Happy times indeed. As I've mentioned before, we're currently caught between an Indian Ocean dipole and a La Nina event. We've been in a wet cycle for our 3rd spring in a row, and each of these seasons has been different, but wet. Major floods on the mainland, especially the eastern half of the mainland, have wreaked havoc on townships and cities. Some places like Lismore in New South Wales have had 5 major, that is 1 in 100 year type events in 3 years. This spring the system seemed to have set up a pattern we can almost set our watch by. The week starts off with a cold change hitting Tasmania in the wake of a front that stretches from northwest of the mainland up round Broome and the Kimberleys down to the Great Australian Bight, which rolls across the continent dropping large amounts of rain on the eastern states. A month back we had severe floods in our part of the world that lasted a few days. Lismore on the mainland was spared this time, but towns like Forbes have been flooded a few times. It's a fair way down the river systems. Any rain in the ranges eventually finds its way to Forbes. There's about 50 flood warnings in New South Wales alone at the moment, so things aren't good. Further north of Forbes, in the central tablelands of New South Wales, rain on Wednesday night hit so hard and quick that people had 15 minutes to, 1, realise it was raining that heavily, and 2 in the morning, and then get to their roofs to avoid drowning. The soils across the eastern half of this wide brown land are well soaked to the point of ruined cereal crops in some places, and what's known as a green drought in others. That is, there's plenty of stock feed growing, but it's basically green-coloured water until the plants start to mature. There's actually some feed value in it. So much of the vegetable growing areas have been flooded that potatoes are now not available in supermarkets. Frozen chips are, but not fresh potatoes, and they're not really the same thing, obviously. And we went through a lettuce shortage earlier this year because of flood damages. Interesting times indeed. So waves of rain, a cool to cold spell, a warm day or two, and back to rain. And when I say rain, it's in the 20 to 40 mil range here in the northwest of Tasmania. Although one weekend we did get 89 mil about a month ago. However, it's up to 200 mils on the mainland where the catchments are already sodden. Add into this the beginning of the 4th wave of COVID here in Oz, and things are getting interestinger. I know that's not a real word, but it fits. The intensity of these weather patterns appears to be a matter of climate change, and following the black summer of 2019-20 when things burnt to the waterline, things in general have been increasingly tough. Clearly not Ukraine tough, but not golden either. So let's have some good news. With the change in government earlier this year, from a god-bothering, pocket-lining amateur kleptocracy, personal view, we have some climate science certainty in the halls of leadership. And to that end, a new green hydrogen project is set to start building later this year, in the last month basically, with the first fuel coming out of the plant next year. Now, green hydrogen is the only zero-emission type. The energy required to split the molecules of hydrogen from the single oxygen in water is being provided by renewables, solar PV and wind turbines. The site is a few hours north of Perth in WA, where sunshine and wind abound. Equally, other nations cannot turn these off or on, as with the Russians have with natural gas and the Saudis with their reduced oil production. And whilst hydrogen is a mature industry, meaning the containment, transport and burning thereof is established, it seems batteries will be the main form for personal transport fuel. Hydrogen, though, is much better suited to ships, trucks, tractors, and maybe even aircraft, the Hindenburg disaster notwithstanding. As I say, it's a well-established fuel source useful for nitrogen fertiliser production if we're going to keep using that for the interim until regenerative processes percolate throughout the whole ag systems of the world. The less comforting news from the past few weeks has been the raising of the idea of geoengineering again. And I'm in two minds about this. We have buggered up the climate by not paying attention to what we were doing. Using geoengineering, say spraying water droplets into the atmosphere to reflect light and so reduce temperatures, is an option, as is the dumping of iron filings into the ocean to achieve greater carbon dioxide drawdown effect. Another idea floated a few years ago was the spraying of sulphurous particles into the atmosphere to counter rising temperatures. Unfortunately, the well-known side effect of which is acid rain. Nothing happens without a side effect, it seems. Sometimes an unknown side effect until we're in the middle of it. The gut says no to geoengineering, but the mind is more open. Thinking about other attempts to modify ecosystems, a salient point becomes obvious. The science needs to be followed. A few examples. By the 1920s, some 60 million acres of Queensland and New South Wales agricultural land had been taken out of production by the prickly pear, Opuntia monocantha, a form of cactus cultivated in the Mediterranean and across the Americas, had no native predators or diseases here in Australia, and reproduces by putting roots down wherever it touches the ground. Some were introduced by Captain Arthur Phillip, first Governor of New South Wales, to feed cochineal beetles for a dye trade in the colony. And these things seem to be reasonably well contained to the coast. In the late 1800s, different species were introduced and carried west of the Great Dividing Range for use as hedges and drought fodder in the rangelands of Queensland and New South Wales. They took off, exploding to the 60 million acres mentioned above. In 1886 and again in 1901 and 1924, New South Wales passed laws making landholders responsible for its eradication on land they held. And this did not work. In 1913, the Queensland Government set up a scheme where biologists travelled to origin sites around the world to identify biological options for eradication. These were identified, but the whole process was put on hold because of World War I. In 1920, a joint Commonwealth, New South Wales and Queensland effort decided on using the Cactoblastus cactorum moth, a native of a small area in Argentina. It turns out the larvae, caterpillar stage, lives on nothing but prickly pear, thus dying out when their feed source does, and not breeding like rabbits. Well, yeah, they did breed like rabbits, but only on the pear after they were released in 1926, with full scientific testing and peer review. By 1933, that's 7 years after it had been introduced, 80% of the infestation had been eradicated. Now, some pockets still exist today. I had one plant on a property at Mudgee on the central tablelands in New South Wales, and I can confirm they root wherever they touch the ground. And I can also confirm that they're gutted by the Cactoblastus larvae, which lives on wherever the plant survives. It was just the one plant, as I say. And once the Cactoblastus had done their worst, or best, I dug up what was left and dried it out on a concrete pad where it was unable to root. And its demise was chiefly observed. Now that's a long-winded explanation to say that when backed by science, imbalances caused by humans can, in some cases, be reversed. But the science must be rigorous and free from political interference. The example when this isn't the case is just as instructive. From a paper called The Cane Toad, Bufo Marinus, a fact sheet. Quote, cane toads are native to South and Central America, are extremely hardy animals and voracious predators of insects and other small prey. These qualities led to their introduction into Australia as a means of controlling pest beetles in the sugarcane industry in 1935, before the use of agricultural chemicals became widespread, end quote. Introduced, I might add, against the advice of the biologists, but in time for an election. You can imagine the thinking. We beat the prickly pear, we can beat the cane beetle. Those scientists are just being overcautious. Well, they weren't, and now the cane toad has infested country across Queensland, is heading towards Newcastle north of Sydney to the south, and threatening Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory to the west. The introduction may have won an election in the bush electorates, but the damage has been enormous. The point being that geoengineering may be a necessary evil in our need to mitigate global warming and its inherent climate change effects, but we should be doing all we can to reduce greenhouse gas output and restore the carbon in the soils of the world. A move above 1.5 degrees C in ambient temperatures will probably require some form of geoengineering. I believe we're currently at 1.3 and things aren't good now. But we really need to be cautious. The cane toad is bad enough in parts of a continent, but a planetary scale error would be an existential threat to us all. So plant a garden, do what you can, and read as widely as possible, especially peer-reviewed material. I know it can be a little, well, let's face it, horrendously dense and full of jargon, but we must make the effort to be informed. It is only through knowledge and its application we can work our way out of this mess. Change Underground Academy No Dig Gardening course is still available for those interested. Link in the show notes. Please tell your friends. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening. I'll be back, all things being equal, next week.